In the middle of a red, dusty train station in the west, a woman holding a newborn baby stood frozen as if petrified when she realized that the man who promised to marry her had left without a word. In a desolate, foreign land, the wind blew so cold that even hope trembled, and in the moment when it seemed like a mother's heart could break from grief, a cowboy walked over and said only one sentence very softly. "Let me hold you and your child. If it were you, amidst loneliness and fear, would you have the courage to entrust your life to a stranger?" How many times in life do we stand at the crossroads of fate and are forced to choose? Even though our hearts are not ready, have you ever wished that someone would come along at the right time, just to tell you that you don't have to struggle alone anymore? We invite you to step into this story, where adversity gives birth to hope, where wounded souls find light from each other's gentle silence. If you feel something touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to accompany the love stories in the wild frontier. The morning wind at Dry Creek Station blew through the old tin roofs, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and burnt grass that characterizes Wyoming in late autumn. It wasn't quite cold, but the wind still blew like needles, piercing the thin coat Clara Hollis was wearing, pulled close to her body. The train from the east had just rolled off the tracks, leaving a trail of gray smoke in its wake. Clara stood there, small in the barren train station, her eyes dark from the 400 miles of travel. In her arms, 6-month-old Jonas stirred slightly, his tiny hands clutching at his mother's shirt. He did not cry, only breathing weakly, as if he could sense the uneasiness that enveloped his mother. Clara took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice calm as she asked the old conductor who was packing his luggage, "Excuse me, is there someone named Jonas Reed here to pick me up? It's my fiancé." Her voice was as small as a breeze, even though her heart was a mixture of hope and worry. The old conductor looked around the station, his hands apologetically on his hips. "Madam, I'm afraid I haven't seen anyone like that." Has he not sent any message? Clara pulled an old letter from her pocket, yellowed and folded beyond count. Jonas Reed, a man Clara had never met, wrote that he wanted a gentle, home-loving wife, and that Dry Creek would be the place where they would start a new life. The words had been Clara's only hope when she was abandoned in Ohio, with a newborn baby and nowhere else to go. Clara put her hand to her chest, as if to calm her racing heart. At that moment, little Jonas suddenly cried out. The cry echoed across the vast platform, attracting a few curious glances. A woman, wearing a headscarf, whispered to the person standing next to her, mail-order bride with a baby. Good heavens! What are you looking for here? Clara heard. She heard everything, but as a habit forged from years of suffering, she bowed her head, held the baby tighter, and said nothing. The conductor hesitated for a few seconds before continuing. "Miss, there is something I'm afraid to say." He smacked his lips. "Last night, a tall man in a brown hat, who seemed to fit your description, left Dry Creek on a stagecoach heading south. No one knows where he went." Clara felt as if the ground had fallen away from her. There was no screaming, no sobbing, just a thick silence that enveloped her like a cold mist rising from the depths of High Mesa Valley. Jonas cried harder, raspy with hunger and fatigue. Clara sat down on the rough wooden bench of the station, her hands shaking so much she could barely open her bag to get her baby's bottle. Trains continued to come and go. Strangers continued to greet each other. Packages continued to be loaded onto the train. Everything continued to move. Except Clara. She just sat there, a forgotten shadow. The wind blew harder, causing the shawl that hung from her shoulders to flutter to one side. Clara bent down and kissed his soft hair. "It's okay, Jonas. I'm here. No matter what, I'm here." But she didn't know how much power those words had. Little Jonas sobbed so hard and so fast that Clara began to panic. She searched her pockets for a handkerchief, for a bottle. Her hands were so tangled they wouldn't obey her. A familiar fear arose, the fear of being too weak to protect her child, the fear of being left behind, the fear of failing again. She tried to keep calm, but her breathing became labored. And then, A tall figure stood in front of her, blocking the afternoon sunlight that was shining on the bench. A deep, slightly hoarse voice, the voice of someone who was used to talking little and doing a lot, rang out, "Ma'am, let me help." "The boy is cold." Clara looked up. Standing before her was a middle-aged man, about 46. His face was tanned, with deep lines around his eyes, and his beard trimmed. His leather jacket reached to his knees, his boots covered in prairie dust, the kind of man the harsh West produces steadfast and quiet. Clara held her breath. I can take care of myself." She said so, but her hands were shaking so much that she couldn't hold the baby close to her body. The man observed for a second. No judgment, no undue pity, just a knowing look, as if he had seen similar scenes many times before. Then he spoke slowly, in a steady and warm voice. "The boy needs to be warmed up right away, and your hands are cold. If you'll excuse me, let me hold him for a while." Clara hesitated. This was strange ground. This man was a stranger too, but there was something about his calm demeanor that made her feel less afraid, like when she had tended to wounded soldiers amid cannon fire, and had strong eyes that made you trust, even if you didn't understand why. Clara nodded slightly. "Oh, okay, but please be careful." The man took off his gloves and held out his arms to take little Jonas. His movements were slow and steady, as if he had held many children before. After a few seconds, the baby's cries began to subside. Clara could only look on, surprised and moved. He wrapped the corner of his large, warm, heavy leather jacket around her. The jacket blocked any wind that blew. He rocked the baby gently to soothe him to sleep. Little Jonas hiccuped a few times and curled up against the man's chest. Strangely at peace, Clara sat motionless. The months of exhaustion seemed to be starting to melt away, bit by bit. He looked up at her, his eyes sincere. "My name is Elias Maddox. Call me Eli. I live on Maddox Ranch, about 4 miles west of here." Clara bowed her head slightly. I am Clara Hollis. I was promised to come here to get married, but he left." Eli nodded sympathetically, not curious, not questioning, just the slight nod of someone who understood that some pains should not be probed too deeply. The wind gently blew Eli's hat strings, revealing experienced, light brown eyes that made one believe he had lived long enough to know how to keep quiet when silence was necessary. He looked at little Jonas, then at Clara. "You can't sit out here forever. The wind blows down from high mesa, getting colder as the afternoon goes on." Then he said something that left Clara breathless for a moment. "If you don't have a place to go, you can stay at my ranch, at least until you figure out your next move." Clara opened her mouth but had no words. Since Ohio, no one had put a hand on her shoulder and said such a kind word. Baby Jonas fell asleep in Eli's arms, looking as if he had found safety. And that was the first moment, a very small one. Clara felt her heart ache not with pain, but with a little hope. In the empty station, Eli Maddox stood still like an old tree standing firm in the prairie wind. He did not hurry or leave, just held little Jonas in his arms as if it were the most natural thing to do that afternoon. Clara looked at him for a few long seconds, then turned away to hide the lump in her throat. A stranger shouldn't be so kind. But there he was, with his calm eyes and unassuming warmth. Clara stood up, adjusted her shawl, and grabbed the strap of her duffel bag. She asked cautiously, afraid that what she was about to say would make things too fragile. "Are you sure? I don't want to bother anyone." Eli leaned down slightly to see her face under the wide brim of his hat. His voice was low and slightly hoarse, like wood polished by many winters. "You don't have to worry about me. There's a seat available on the way back to the farm. If you need me, I'll take you to Sheriff Briggs and see if he can help you. But first, you and the boy need to rest." Clara remained silent. She was used to calculating every step of her survival, but her mind was too exhausted to think beyond the task of keeping the child out of the cold. There was a long pause. Then she nodded slightly, as if the decision came from somewhere deeper than reason. "Okay, I'll go with you, just for a while." Eli's only response was a nod, as light as a breath. He held little Jonas close to his chest, one arm supporting his head, the other hand draping the corner of his leather jacket over him. His movements were so practiced that Clara forgot for a moment that they had been complete strangers only a few minutes before. The two of them left the train station and walked to the lot where Eli had tied the horse and the small wagon. The sun was sinking behind the high mesa hills, the last light of day casting a thin golden glow that slowed everything down. Clara followed Eli, her worn shoes sinking lightly into the dry dust beside the road. Eli opened the wagon door, still holding baby Jonas firmly. "You go first. I'll put the boy in your lap, and then we'll go." Clara climbed in. The seat was covered with several dark brown wool blankets. The scent of pine and old leather lingered in the air, strangely reassuring. Eli climbed into the back, handed baby Jonas to her, and got into the driver's seat. The wagon moved. The wheels rolled over the rough ground so steadily that little Jonas stirred slightly and fell back asleep. Clara opened the bag, wiped his face with a towel, and stroked his soft hair in slow motions. Through the small crack in the door, she saw Eli's broad back in the pale afternoon light and wondered why the man was so willing to help them so calmly. Eli spoke after a long pause. The journey wasn't easy. The trip from the east was tiring. She came all the way from Ohio. Clara squeezed the blanket around her. "Yes, I was no longer there." Eli didn't ask any more questions. The only sound was the sound of hooves hitting the hard ground and the wind blowing across the hillside. The silence didn't bother Clara. It felt like a space to breathe, a space for her mind to not struggle with anything else. After a while, Clara asked quietly, "Do you often help strangers like this?" Eli's shoulders relaxed as if that reminded him of something. "Not often, but I know when someone looks around and sees nowhere to turn. High Mesa isn't an easy place to live. Here, people help each other out when they need to. That's it." Clara felt her throat burn as she listened. She turned away from him to avoid his gaze. Gray-green bushes lined the road. In the distance, low mountains were hidden in the thin afternoon clouds. The scene was so desolate that it might seem lonely to a newcomer, but in Eli's eyes, it felt strangely safe. As the wagon climbed a small hill, Clara asked softly, as if afraid to break the peaceful moment, "Your farm, are there many people, just 3 or 4 of us? My sister Abigail and Uncle Grady, we can manage with that many. And you?" The last sentence was added after a pause. It was as light as a speck of dust, but enough to make Clara's heart slow down a beat. After nearly half an hour of driving, the sky turned amber. Eli pointed to a valley opening up ahead. It was High Mesa Valley. My house was across the creek. Clara watched. Old wooden fences lined the hillside. Thin smoke rose from a distant wooden roof. Horses grazed around the stables. It all appeared in the afternoon light, like a simple picture she never thought she could touch. The wagon stopped in front of the dirt yard. Eli jumped out first and held out his hand to Clara. His hand was rough, warm, and so firm that Clara felt her feet steady as she set foot on the ground. Abigail Maddox stepped out from the porch, a woman in her late 40s with a gentle face, delicate eyes, and a voice as smooth as a stream. "Eli, you're back, and this guest." Clara bowed her head, somewhat embarrassed. "I am Clara Hollis. We're just staying for a short while." Abigail looked at her without judgment or curiosity. "Go inside. I'll put some hot water on." The boy looked like he needed to be warmed up. Clara chuckled softly, though her eyes stung a little. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her with such genuine concern. Eli stood beside her, offering her bag. "You go in first. The empty room is at the end of the row. High Mesa nights are colder than you think." Clara stepped into the small wooden house. Oil lamps lit the walls. The smell of cornbread wafted from the kitchen, and the crackling of wood. The warmth permeated the air. Slowing her steps, A strange but gentle feeling was creeping into her. Maybe it was only temporary. Maybe it was just an illusion of a tired afternoon. But Clara knew one thing for sure: this place made her want to breathe a little deeper, to believe in tomorrow, even if only a little bit. Little Jonas lay in Clara's arms, sleeping soundly and peacefully. The sight made her squeeze him gently and whisper something to herself, but loud enough for her heart to hear. Or maybe, I found a place to rest. Eli stood outside the door, watching the mother and son enter the room. He took off his hat and wiped his face with a calloused hand. In the fading light, his quiet demeanor softened. Though he did not say so, he himself sensed that something in the afternoon at Dry Creek Station had moved his silent heart. Maybe it's just the beginning. Clara put the cloth bag down in the corner and closed the door. The small room was at the end of the hallway. The walls were old but solid wood, and the light from the oil lamp from the hallway filtered through the cracks in the door, creating warm yellow streaks of light. She laid little Jonas down on the small bed that Abigail had quickly prepared. With 2 thick blankets that smelled of dry sunlight and homemade soap, the baby tossed and turned a little and then fell into a deep sleep, as if the long journey had never happened. Clara leaned down and kissed her son on the forehead. She exhaled slowly. It had all happened so fast from the moment she stepped off the Dry Creek train station to entering this room. So fast that she began to worry if it had been a fluke or a real shelter. Abigail knocked lightly on the door. "Clara, the hot water is ready. Go ahead and shower first. If you need anything, just let me know." Clara nodded her thanks. She followed Abigail to the back kitchen. There was a bucket of water steaming gently, the firelight reflecting off the woman's gentle face. Clara washed her face and hands, then sat down on the bench to dry them. The warmth seeped into her skin, and she almost cried. Abigail smiled. It had been so long since the house had heard the sound of children. She must be tired, but don't worry. Consider this your temporary home. Clara bowed her head, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you. I didn't know what else to say." Abigail put her hand on Clara's shoulder. "Some things don't need to be said. We are women. We understand each other." Those words filled a small void in Clara's heart. She couldn't remember how long it had been since she had heard such a gentle woman's voice, since she had lost her loved ones, since she had struggled to stand firm in life, carrying a child all by herself. Clara sat silently, watching the fire. Part of her was still tense, as reserved as a wounded bird, but another part of her began to warm up to the kindness of strangers. When Clara returned to the room, Jonas was still sleeping soundly. She sat by the bed for a moment, her head resting on the worn wooden headboard, her hands clasped together. A sense of peace seeped into her every breath. Suddenly, she remembered Eli holding Jonas at the train station. That image, even for a brief moment, brought a sense of security she hadn't felt in months. Outside the window, the sky had turned a deep purple. A few lights from the stable shimmered in the thin mist. Clara pulled back the curtains and stood. She needed help to dispel the feeling that she was enjoying too much, to find something that would make her feel worthy of this kindness. She stepped out into the hallway. The firelight from the stove cast a soft glow, and Eli stood by the porch post. He was checking the reins, his hand moving rhythmically, slowly. His stance was as steady as a rock on the edge of a valley. Clara came closer. "Can I help?" Eli looked up. His eyes were calm and deep in the lamplight. She didn't need to do anything tonight. It had been a long day. Just get some rest. Clara shook her head slightly. "I felt like I should try to do something. At least, so I wouldn't find myself just sitting there enjoying it." Eli looked at her a moment longer, as if considering what to say. "If you want, help Abigail with breakfast tomorrow. She's always busy in the mornings, but leave it to us tonight." Clara pursed her lips and nodded. "Okay, well, thank you." Eli returned to his work, but his voice dropped a little when he asked, how long had she been gone? More than a week. Eli didn't ask any more, but Clara felt like saying something, as if to fill the void that stretched between them. I left Ohio because there was no one else there. Eli stopped, his eyes on her but not pressing. I understood. Clara smiled faintly, a very thin smile. He really understood. Eli did not speak at once. The wind from the valley carried the smell of dry grass and road dust and passed through the slats, making the wind chimes tinkle softly. Finally, he answered softly. The city where I used to live was no longer home when the person I loved left this world. I moved here, into this valley, to start over. So I understood when she said she had nowhere to go. Clara was silent. The words were not empty comfort. They carried the weight of experience, of loss, of long nights in the open west with only the wind for company. She nodded slightly. I'm sorry to hear that. It's okay. Everyone has to learn to move on in their own way. And so did she. A gust of wind blew, making Clara shiver. Eli took a step forward, as if unconsciously wanting to shield her from the wind. It was getting cold. She should go inside. Tomorrow would be a long day. Clara went back inside, but before closing the door, she looked out onto the porch once more. Eli was still standing there, as still as his own. A strange feeling crept into her heart. Not quite trust, nor doubt. It was like a slow heartbeat, but very clear. When Clara returned to the room, Jonas was still asleep. She sat down beside him. Outside the window, the first moon hung low, its pale light illuminating the distant trees. It had been a long day, with so many changes, but it had ended with a strange sense of peace. Clara touched her son's forehead gently. We're safe now. Jonas. She lay down beside her child. The small room seemed to embrace them, as if to protect them from the pain that had haunted them for so long. For the first time in many nights, Clara closed her eyes without trembling with fear of the future, and before she fell asleep she realized something secretly. Whatever tomorrow brought, this land, that man, was probably the best thing she had seen in a long time. The warm, dim morning light filtered through the curtains, waking Clara with the soft light of the early morning prairie. She opened her eyes, taking a moment to remember where she was. There was no more sound of wheels grinding on the rails, no more smell of train smoke. There was only the sound of wind blowing through the wooden fence and the faint sound of horses stirring in the yard. Little Jonas was sleeping soundly beside her. His small head was resting on her shoulder, his lips slightly parted as if he were dreaming something sweet. Clara stroked his hair and sat up. A new day in an unfamiliar land awaited her outside the door. When Clara entered the kitchen, Abigail was standing at the stove stirring a pot of simmering cornmeal. The sweet aroma filled the wooden house, making one feel at peace. Abigail smiled when she saw Clara. Good morning. Hope you had a good sleep. Clara nodded. I honestly couldn't remember the last time I slept so well. Abigail poured her sister a cup of hot tea made from dried mint leaves hanging in the kitchen loft. The first day was always hard, but she would get used to it. Life in the valley was slow, and coming here felt like breathing again. Clara sat down on the wooden bench. The faint neighing of a horse echoed in the distance. The morning light filtered through the small window, causing the chalk dust to shimmer like gold particles. In that moment, Clara realized that her body felt much lighter than it had been in the past weeks of wandering. Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway, his sleeves rolled up, his boots still covered in dew. Good morning. His voice was slightly hoarse, but not cold. Clara responded with a small smile. You've been up for a long time. Right. Eli adjusted his belt, looking out into the yard. The horses don't sleep in like we do. I have to check the west fence. The wind was strong last night. Abigail set the bowl of porridge before him. Eat something first. Don't climb the hill on an empty stomach. Eli sat down and quietly took a few spoonfuls of porridge. Clara watched him for a moment, then quickly looked away when she caught his eye. She didn't want to pay too much attention, but there was something about his calm demeanor that made it hard to look away. When he finished eating, Eli stood up, put on his hat, and looked at Clara. If she wanted to walk around the farm, she could. It was safe here. But if she needed help in the kitchen or wanted to know how to do anything, she could ask Abigail. Clara nodded. Yes. Thank you. Eli said nothing more. He stepped out into the yard, closing the door gently so the wind wouldn't blow into the kitchen. The sound was like a silence between the two of them, just enough for Clara to hear her heart skip a beat. Abigail smiled slightly. My brother was always like that. A man of few words, but deeper in thought than one might think. Clara bowed her head, unable to hide her embarrassment. He was too kind to a stranger like me. Abigail set the napkin on the table. No, Eli was always kind, but not to everyone. He saw things that others missed. Clara was silent. Abigail's voice seemed to paint a picture of Eli that Clara herself did not fully understand. After breakfast, Clara took little Jonas out into the yard for some fresh air. The wind from the valley blew across the grass, creating ripples like water. In the distance, Eli was repairing the fence, hammering each panel with a wooden hammer, patient and steady. Clara didn't mean to stare, but the sight made her feel strange. It was as if his presence made the land less desolate. Little Jonas mumbled something, making Clara laugh softly. Does this place look okay? Much more peaceful than the places we've been. Right. Her voice was lost in the wind, blending into the slow rhythm of life that the valley brought. When Clara returned to the kitchen, Abigail was preparing a pot of dish soap. Would she like to practice doing something? Clara smiled, thanking me for the kind offer. I'd love to. Tell me what I can do. Abigail handed her sister a towel and a basket of vegetables. Pick some for me. We're making stew and high mesa. It's a comfort food on windy days. Clara began her work with skillful hands, but slightly trembling because it was unfamiliar. The smell of fresh vegetables and fruits from the backyard reminded her of meals in the past, when the family was still together. Those memories no longer hurt her as before, only leaving her with a slight feeling of unease. Abigail's voice came from behind her. Clara, you can stay here as long as you want. No one is forcing you. Clara raised her head. I don't want to bother you guys. I'll leave when I find a way to settle down. Abigail sat down beside her, speaking softly. She didn't have to rush. Everyone here had to start over once. High Mesa was where you caught your breath. Clara, she would too. Clara bowed her head, her heart warming little by little. Those words were like cool spring water flowing into a still red wound. The afternoon passed in small tasks. The clink of spoons against the pot. Jonas laughing as Abigail teased him. Clara helped with the cooking, baking, washing the dishes. These seemingly ordinary tasks made her feel like she had a place in this house. The afternoon was drawing to a close. The wind had changed direction, bringing a chill from the mountains to the north. Eli returned from his work outside the fence. His coat was covered with a thin layer of dust. As he passed the porch, he paused to remove his shoes and shake them off before entering. Little Jonas saw Eli and giggled, waving his arms. Clara was a little taken aback by this. Eli smiled a rare little smile. He stepped closer and held out his hand. Let me hold the baby. Clara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Eli picked up little Konas, adjusting his position so his head wasn't tilted too far. He walked out onto the porch, rocking the baby with his steps. His voice was a low, indistinct hum, like a lullaby a man from the Midwest invents when he can't remember the old ones. Clara leaned against the doorframe, watching the two of them. It was such a peaceful scene that she wanted to turn away, afraid that she would feel too much, afraid that everything would disappear like the evening mist. Eli returned with baby Jonas in his arms. He was fine. He would grow up quickly. Clara smiled slightly. Thank you. Eli looked at her for a few seconds, his eyes softening without saying a word. That evening, as the oil lamp was lit, Clara suddenly realized something quietly. This land could heal if she gave it the chance, and perhaps the people here, somehow, had put a new beat into her seemingly cold heart. The next morning, the sky over Dry Creek was covered with a thin layer of clouds. enough to cast a soft white light over it. Clara had just placed baby Jonas in the small crib Eli and Grady had fixed the night before when Abigail entered, holding a beige scarf. "I want to go into town to buy some things today. Would Clara like to come? I think you'll need some new things." Clara looked at little Jonas. He was sleeping peacefully, so she nodded, though her heart sank. Part of her wanted to avoid the stranger's gaze, but she also knew that sooner or later she would have to face the world outside the farm. As the two were about to board the carriage, Eli emerged from the stables, holding the dusty reins in his hand. He looked at Clara for a second longer than usual. "If anything happens, you can find Sheriff Briggs. He's trustworthy." Clara paused slightly. "You say that. Does that mean I should be careful?" Eli answered in a low voice. "Not alarming, but not dismissive either. Dry Creek wasn't a nice place, but she was with Abigail. She'd be fine." Abigail smiled. "Don't scare her. There are only a few people in town who speak a little harshly, but they just say, 'We can't hurt you.'" Clara said nothing more, just tightened her scarf. She got into the car. The cold morning wind blew across her neck, making her shiver slightly. The carriage left Maddox Ranch and followed the dirt road down to town. On either side, the underbrush glittered in the sunlight. In the distance, the dark green mountains hugged the valley like the great arms of the West. Clara took a deep breath, trying to calm her mind. Days at the ranch had made it easier to breathe, but stepping outside made old wounds ache. Abigail whispered as the car rolled down the quiet road, "Don't worry, I'll be with you." Clara looked at her gratefully. I was grateful for that. The carriage stopped in front of a small general store. The wooden sign hung and swayed in the wind. This was where Dry Creek residents bought everything from nails to flour. As Clara stepped out, several glances turned toward her, not hostile, but enough to make her notice the curiosity. Abigail stepped closer, touching Clara's arm reassuringly. Small towns were full of gossip. Just don't let it get to you. The two of them stepped inside. The wooden stall smelled of familiar pine resin. Clara was bending down to pick out some spools of thread when an elderly woman's voice rang out behind her. "Is that her? The woman who came as a bride by letter, with a baby in tow? I heard the man who promised to marry her didn't show up to pick her up." Another voice cut in, lower but sharp. Women like that usually had their reasons. No one left home if everything was okay. Clara froze, her hands gripping the thread so tightly her nails dug into her skin. Abigail turned around, her eyes cold and uncharacteristically cold. "Mrs. Carter, you seem to be forgetting that no one here has the right to judge anyone else." The woman in front of her shrugged, seemingly unfazed. "I was just stating the truth. Children don't come naturally. She came here without knowing where the father was. Something must be wrong." Clara bowed her head. Part of her wanted to run away from this place immediately. The words were not new. She had heard them many times, from many mouths, each time cutting into the same place in her heart. But before Clara could say anything, heavy footsteps echoed through the store. Eli appeared in the doorway, his silhouette cast by the wooden floor. He didn't look around, just stared straight at the group of women talking. I heard it all. The whole store was silent. Eli stepped closer, his voice so calm it was more frightening than angry. "If anyone in this town intended to hurt or defame the woman at my ranch, they would have to talk to me directly, and I could guarantee it wouldn't be a pleasant conversation." No one responded. No one dared. Abigail placed her hand on Clara's shoulder so lightly that only Clara could feel it. "Let's go. Don't mind them." Clara nodded and followed her sister, but her heart was still pounding, not from fear, but from a strong, suffocating sense of protection. As she left the store, Clara looked at Eli for a second. Why was he here? Eli crossed his arms, his eyes softening slightly. "I needed to buy something at the back door. But I heard a noise, so I had to go in and check." Clara lowered her eyes. They were right. I shouldn't have appeared in public. I didn't want to bother him or his ranch. Eli stood up straighter, his voice low, each word as firm as a stake driven into the ground. It wasn't her fault. Everyone here had a past, but her past didn't give anyone the right to hurt her. Clara looked him straight in the eye for the first time, feeling her throat tighten. "I wasn't used to having someone on my side," Eli replied breathlessly. She would get used to it. The carriage returned to Maddox Ranch as the sun was high in the sky. Clara held Jonas close to her chest all the way home, filled with thoughts she couldn't name. Humiliation from being talked about, gratitude for being protected, and a warm, smoldering feeling she couldn't face. When she got out of the car, Clara stood silently for a few seconds in front of the porch. The afternoon wind blew, making her skirt flutter slightly. She realized that although the storm in people's hearts was still there, this land, this house, and that quiet man had started a new path for her. No one heals overnight. But Clara knew for the first time in a long time, she was not alone. The afternoon on the prairie passed in a pale yellow, like a thin blanket covering the valley. The wind had softened, blowing in gentle gusts that made the earth almost breathe. Clara returned from her stormy trip to town, her shoulders still a little tired. She went into the house and placed baby Jonas in the small crib, where Abigail had spread a blanket over him again to keep him warm. The kitchen smelled of cornbread, stew, and herbs. Abigail stood stirring a large pot of soup while Grady Sutton adjusted the oil lamp on the shelf. The cowboy had half his hair gray and a smile as gentle as the afternoon sun that made Clara feel lighter. "She looks pale," Grady said in a deep voice. "Let me tell you something funny to make dinner more enjoyable." Abigail smiled, then glanced at Clara kindly. "You sit down and rest. I'll take care of the rest." Clara asked the maid if she could sit down, but Abigail insisted. Clara sat on the sofa, her hands clasped together, trying to calm the emotions that had lingered from the morning. A moment later, the wooden door to the porch opened softly. Eli walked in with his usual quiet demeanor. His rolled-up shirt was stained with road dust and the scent of the evening wind, but he didn't look tired. When he caught Clara's eye, he paused for a second. "Are you okay?" Clara nodded, but there was still something lingering in the depths of her eyes. "I'm fine. Just a little tired." Eli didn't ask any more questions. He just placed his wide-brimmed hat on the wooden hook and sat down in the chair across from the dining table. His silence wasn't heavy. It was like an invisible support, giving the other person breathing room. Dinner began when it was already dark outside. The oil lamps were lit, casting a golden glow over the table, the simple dishes, and the three people sitting around the old wooden table. Baby Jonas slept peacefully in his crib, breathing evenly. Grady began to tell stories about the time he had chased a stray calf down into the South Ravine, and how he had had to hang from a tree root to pull it up. Each part of the story was accompanied by a burst of laughter from him, and Clara couldn't help but laugh along. The laughter warmed the kitchen so much that it felt like being wrapped in a thick blanket. Eli sat beside her, quietly enjoying his dinner, but every time Clara laughed, the corners of his lips would lift up ever so slightly, enough for anyone paying attention to notice. When Grady ended the story with some joke that made Abigail shake her head in dismay, Eli put down his spoon and looked at Clara. "I know this morning wasn't easy for you." His voice was low, clear, but very soft. Clara bowed her head slightly. "I didn't want to cause trouble." "She didn't do anything. She wasn't the one causing the trouble." Clara touched the handle of the spoon, her eyes slightly dimming. "I'm just not used to having someone on my side, even with just a few words. Eli looked straight at her, not avoiding her gaze. No one deserved to be hurt because of their past. Clara was silent. She didn't want to let her emotions spill over, but something in Eli's voice made her feel soft inside. Abigail stood up to clear the dishes, as if unintentionally giving the two of them a moment alone in the lamplight. Grady stretched too. "I'll go out to the stables to check on the horses. The wind's changed tonight, so I'll have to watch the stable door." The two left the kitchen, leaving Clara and Eli sitting across from each other. Neither spoke for a few breaths. A sad wind from the porch crept in through the crack in the door. Eli broke the silence with a slow question. "Clara, you've been to many places." "Right." Clara nodded. "I left Ohio when Jonas was 2 weeks old. I thought I was strong enough to start over, but each place left me feeling like I didn't belong." Her voice was low, but not trembling. It was like an underground stream that had been flowing for too long and finally found a crack to overflow. Eli tilted his head slightly forward. Belonging wasn't as important as going where you felt at peace. Clara chuckled silently. It was easy for him to say. "It's not easy," Eli replied. "I was just as confused as you. After—" He stopped. The lamplight reflected in his eyes, giving them a deep, old glow. Clara noticed, but did not interfere. "After a while," Eli continued. "After my wife died, I wandered for months. Finally, I returned to High Mesa. I stayed because it gave me a chance to breathe again." Clara looked at him for a long time, not out of curiosity, but because she could feel the truth in his words. Only a man who had lived through real pain could have such a voice. Jonas in the crib suddenly turned over, making a small cooing sound. Clara stood up, picked him up, and patted his back. When she looked up, she saw Eli standing beside her. He placed his hand on the corner of the crib, his eyes as gentle as the early autumn wind. "The baby is healthy. He takes after his mother." Clara was a little confused. Everyone had always said she looked more like her father. Eli looked at her, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't know who the boy's father was, but I know one thing for sure. The man who held him, carried him across half the country, was stronger than anyone." Clara couldn't hide her expression. She turned away, feeling a lump in her throat, not from hurt, from being seen. For the first time in a long time, someone looked at her without measuring, without judgment. Abigail returned at that moment, holding a cup of ginger tea. "Clara, drink this. The night is cold." Clara took the cup of tea, trying to hide her embarrassment in the light of the oil lamp. Eli took a step back, but his eyes still held that quiet warmth. As night fell, Clara stood in the doorway, looking out into the yard. The sky was endless. The stars were as dense as grains of salt sprinkled on the dark sun. The Maddox farmhouse was quiet, except for the sounds of insects and the soft breathing of horses in the stables. Eli stepped across to turn off the porch light. "If it gets too cold, just knock on my door." "Don't be shy," Clara replied softly. "I will remember." He nodded. "Good night." She bowed her head, but as Eli went inside, Clara stood still for a few seconds, listening to her heartbeat, slow. That evening, when Clara returned to her room, she understood one thing. It was not because she was protected that she softened. It was because the man treated her with kindness that was unsolicited. A very rare thing. For the first time, Clara wondered if her heart could find a resting place in this land. The next morning was clearer than usual. The first rays of sunlight crept across the High Mesa hills, touching every wooden roof and every rusty grass. Clara woke to the sound of Jonas stirring. The small room was still warm from the wood stove from the night before. She placed the baby in the crib and wrapped herself in a blanket and went out onto the porch. The morning air was refreshing to Clara. From her vantage point, she could see the valley opening up, streaks of light stretching across the hills. The neighing of horses from the stables sounded like a familiar call. She thought of last night's dinner and Eli's words, still in her ears, as quiet as a stream flowing through her heart. When Clara went down to the kitchen, Abigail was making toast. Grady sat across the table, adjusting his leather strap. He looked up when he saw her. "Good morning, honey. You look less tired today." Clara smiled slightly. "I think I'm getting used to the pace of life here." Abigail poured her sister a cup of warm milk. People lived slowly on the prairie. Take it slow, and she would find her heart breathing again. Clara was about to reply when a horse stopped outside. It was a solid sound, unlike the sound of horses on the ranch. Then came a familiar, deep voice. Eli is talking to someone." Clara tilted her head to look out the window. A figure in a police coat, a badge glinting in the sunlight. Sheriff Briggs. He stood next to Eli, his face so stern it froze the air. Clara paused. Abigail placed her hand gently on hers. "It's okay. I'll go see what's going on." But Eli was looking into the kitchen before Abigail could take a few steps. His eyes accidentally met Clara's. There was a tiny flicker of concern in them, not exactly worry, but enough for Clara to know something was wrong. Sheriff Briggs nodded to the people in the kitchen and entered. "Hello, everyone. Sorry to bother you so early." Eli stood by the door, his face calm but his shoulders slightly tense. Briggs looked at Clara. "Miss Hollis, I need to talk to you about something. About a man named Jonas Reed." Clara's lips trembled slightly. She placed her hands on the table to steady herself. He's been caught." Briggs shook his head. "No, but we tracked him down to a town in the south. And there we found some things he left behind. There were letters and a list of victims he had targeted." Clara felt as if the floor had receded. All the horrible memories she had tried to bury surfaced at once. The last days in Ohio, the contemptuous looks, the whispers, and the decision to risk it all. They all swirled together like a whirlwind. Briggs opened the little book, speaking slowly. Her name was on the list. But what got me going was he had been watching her before he sent the proposal, and he had noted that she was the type to be manipulated. Clara clutched the edge of the table. Her chest tightened, as if the room were closing in. The air felt so heavy that she could hardly breathe. Old memories. The confusion from the war, the disorientation after returning home. All of it was brought back by that simple sentence. Eli stepped halfway up, not touching her but close enough for Clara to feel it. He said to Briggs, "Sheriff, you can give us the details later. She's not well enough to hear this so suddenly." Clara took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice from breaking. "No, let me hear it. I need to know everything." Briggs looked at her sympathetically. "I just wanted to warn you. He knows where you go, where you've been, even your son's name." Clara felt her head spinning, so that meant he could appear here. Briggs nodded very slightly. "We're trying to keep an eye on the movement, but just want everyone to be on the lookout. High Mesa is quiet, but not impossible." Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. Clara stood still, trying not to tremble. Part of her wanted to break down, to cry like a child, but the other part held her up. The part that had gotten her through the war, through the loneliness, the part that had kept her alive until today. Eli placed his hand on the arm of a nearby chair, as if he wanted to put it on Clara's shoulder but hesitated. He spoke slowly and firmly. "Clara isn't alone here. We'll keep an eye on the ranch. No one will hurt you." Clara turned to look at him. His eyes had no hesitation, no pity, no panic, only a firmness and warmth that made her heart want to soften. Briggs left with a few final instructions. As the sound of hooves faded, the room fell into an eerie silence. A cold breeze blew in from the crack in the door, sending shivers down Clara's neck. Abigail put her hand on her sister's back. She wanted to sit still. Clara nodded slowly. She sat down in her chair, her hands clasped together. Something in her eyes was breaking. Eli stood silently beside her, and after a few seconds he spoke softly, his voice softer than anything she had ever heard. "Clara, you don't have to be afraid while you're here." She looked up, and their eyes met. Something quiet but deep ran through her. Clara didn't answer, but her breathing slowed, as if someone had lifted the heaviest weight from her heart. Eli backed away, but before leaving the kitchen, he said one more sentence that made Clara close her eyes slightly. If he had been following her, then he would have understood that now. She was no longer alone. The door closed. Clara sat there, her hand on her chest, aware that her heart was beating to a new rhythm, not quite calm, but more steady than before. Sometimes what scares people most is not the past, but the belief that they have nothing to hold on to. But here at the ranch, among those quiet people, Clara felt something like hope for the first time. The afternoon passed more slowly than usual. The sun rose high in the sky, casting a dry yellow light over high mesa that made anyone standing outside for long feel their throats begin to dry. Clara sat alone on the wooden steps, Jonas asleep in her lap. The wind carried a faint smell of burnt grass, like her days in Ohio, summer afternoons when the earth was dry and cracked like the skin of a field hand. But today, it was not the memories of summer that weighed heavily on her heart. It was the name Jonas Reed, a name the young mother had tried to forget, now quietly rising to the surface like a rock at the bottom of a lake suddenly revealed when the water receded. Clara looked down at her son. His breathing was small and even. Part of her wanted to hold him tight, to protect him from the world, from men who saw women as objects to be possessed. She tried to keep her hands from shaking, but deep in her chest, a feeling of unease crept in, like darkness creeping through the cracks in the door. Abigail walked out and sat down gently beside her. She wanted to talk. Clara shook her head, but her eyes were more urgent than she thought. "I don't know what to do. If he really comes here, I'll put everyone in danger." Abigail put a hand on her shoulder. "Clara, he was the one at fault, not her. No one at the ranch thought otherwise." Clara smiled faintly, her eyes fixed on her hands. "Where I lived, they didn't see it that way. Everyone thought it was my fault for choosing the wrong person." Abigail was silent for a moment. Then she looked up at Clara with a rare determination in her eyes. Her choices did not define her worth. Her way of living did, and I had never known anyone as strong as her. Clara wanted to reply, but her throat tightened. She bowed her head, tears welling up in her eyes, though no drops fell. In the distance came the sound of hooves. When Clara looked up, she saw Eli riding his black horse, Apollo, back from the fields. He stopped at the stable door, stroked the horse's mane, and said something to Grady. The two men stood in the sunlight like two old oak bushes, steady and calm. Clara looked at the scene, and for the first time that day, she felt her fear slow down. Abigail stood up. "I'll get some cold water. Come inside and sit out of the sun." When she was alone on the porch, Clara felt a gentle breeze brush her cheek. It carried a strange kind of loneliness, but it didn't scare her. It was like a reminder that this was where she could learn to stand firm. A moment later, Eli stepped onto the steps. His voice was low, like the sound of the earth echoing from deep within the mountains. Had she eaten? Clara shook her head. "I'm not hungry yet." Eli stood by the porch pillar with her arms crossed. I guessed she was trying to hide her feelings. Clara paused. I didn't know what to say. Eli looked into the distance, where the little bird was swooping toward the ground. When my wife was alive, she would often become silent like that when things happened, as if she stood still long enough, the pain would go away. But life doesn't work like that. Clara turned to look at him. "What do you think I should do?" Eli's voice was firm, but soft enough to calm Clara. She didn't have to do anything. Just let us be with her. The fear felt lighter with someone to share it with. Clara lowered her eyes. "I was so scared that sometimes I thought I shouldn't stay here anymore. If I left, everyone would be safer." Eli shook her head immediately. "No, if she left now, he would have an easier time finding her. But most importantly, she didn't have to run away anymore, not when she had a child who needed to be safe, not when she had someone to rely on." Clara felt her chest tighten and then expand, very slowly. He said it as if I was worthy of being protected by someone else. Eli looked her straight in the eyes. If anyone deserved to be protected, it was her. There was no wind blowing at that moment, but Clara still felt a chill down her spine, not because of fear, but because the words touched the deepest, softest part of her, a part she had hidden away for a long time. Before Clara could say more, Grady appeared from the direction of the stables. "Eli, I checked the hoof prints from this morning on the east road. There were new ones, not from someone at the ranch." Eli turned back immediately. Of course. Grady nodded slowly. Not Apollo's, nor any of our horses. I followed a trail, but the wind was so strong it was lost. Clara clenched her hands on the edge of the porch. Oh, God, that means... Eli interrupted. We haven't confirmed anything yet, but from now on, everyone will be more careful. Abigail came out of the house, looking worried. Eli, do you think... Eli held up a hand. No guessing. Briggs will be back tonight. We'll tell him? Clara stood up, feeling the ground rise beneath her feet. I'm sorry for bringing danger here. Eli turned back, his voice low but firm. It wasn't her fault. None of this was her fault. Clara wanted to protest, to say it would have been easier if she had never set foot on High Mesa. But Eli's gaze held her back. It was silent, but the message was clear. Don't burden yourself any more. The afternoon came slowly. The sky turned from orange to red to purple. Clara stood in the kitchen, watching the fire crackle in the wood stove. The crackles were steady, like the steady heartbeat of the house. Abigail was cooking stew for dinner, and Grady lit the kerosene lamps, spreading golden light in every corner. Clara felt one thing clearly. Although there was a darkness approaching inside her, she was no longer alone in facing it. Each person in this house, in their own way, stood between her and that past. And through it all, one thing Clara saw more clearly than ever. Eli Maddox didn't just want to protect her out of duty. He did it because there was something deeper brewing, even if he hadn't yet put it into words. That night, as Clara put Jonas into his crib, she kissed his forehead and whispered, Son, maybe we really have come to the right place. No matter what storm comes, I believe we can still stand firm. The sun came down faster than usual. As darkness fell over the prairie, the sky became a black blanket of stars. The air carried a hint of the highland night. Enough that longtime High Mesa residents knew that a change in wind direction was a sign of trouble. Clara stood by her window, holding Jonas, who had fallen asleep. Outside, a crescent moon hung thin as a silver thread behind the cottonwood trees. She laid Jonas down in the crib and sat still for a moment, listening to his rhythmic breathing. The sound was the only peace she had left in the day. But then the distant sound of hoofbeats broke the silence, a sound clearer, more decisive, and heavier than the sounds of the afternoon. Clara shivered slightly. She walked out of the room, moving as silently as a shadow. At the end of the hall, the kerosene lamp from the common room shone. As Clara approached, she saw Eli talking to Briggs, both of their voices low but sharp. Abigail and Grady sat in the corner, watching silently. Briggs put his police cap down on the table and wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. I passed through a few checkpoints. Someone reported seeing a man on horseback north of town. No one gave a description, but he seemed to be hiding his face. Eli crossed his arms, his back hunched forward. North led straight to High Mesa. Yes, Briggs replied, his voice heavy as stone. I can't say for sure, but at this point, it's definitely better to be cautious. Clara stood silently in the doorway. She didn't want to interrupt, but hearing every word made her chest feel as if someone had placed a rock on it. Eli saw her shadow first. Clara, come here. His voice was not commanding, but it did not allow her to refuse. Clara entered, keeping herself from trembling. Briggs pulled out a chair for her. Miss Hollis, I want to be clear. We won't let anyone on the ranch, but you need to be careful, especially when you go out. Clara nodded slightly. I understand. Briggs looked her in the eyes, then lowered his voice. I know you've been through a lot, but you're not alone here. Believe that, at least until we catch him. Clara did not reply, but the hand on her knee was clenched enough to show gratitude. After Briggs left the ranch, the only sound in the house was the wind blowing through the cracks in the door and the creaking of wood as the temperature dropped. Abigail got up to clear the tea, and Grady went outside to check the lock on the barn door. Eli and Clara were left alone in the warm yellow light of the kerosene lamp. Eli leaned against the edge of the table, looking at Clara with eyes that couldn't hide the anxiety. She had been scared all day. Hadn't she? Clara didn't hide it, just nodded slightly. I didn't want to do this. I'd been running for so long, but it seemed like the past always found me. Eli moved a little closer. Clara, everyone has something they want to run away from. Me too, but no one can run forever. At some point, you have to choose to stay. Clara looked at him, and she felt the sincerity in his breath. What had he been so afraid of? Eli did not answer immediately. He looked up at the oil lamp flame as if searching for words in its flickering light. I used to be afraid that I wouldn't be able to protect the people I loved. Clara paused, the words simple but penetrating like a knife to an old wound. Eli continued, his voice low. My wife died of illness that winter. I didn't see the signs. I thought it was just a cold. When I realized, it was too late. Clara saw his hand twitch slightly, as if the memory still stung. He sat down in front of her, not too close, but close enough that the distance between them seemed to shrink. After she died, I kept blaming myself, thinking that if I had paid more attention, if I had been there for her more, things would have been different. I shut myself away, thinking that I was no longer worthy of protecting anyone. Clara bowed her head. Eli, I don't know. No one here knows. Eli said slowly. Not that I hid it. It was just, the timing wasn't right. They looked at each other for a long time, without needing many words. Clara saw in his eyes not only strength, but also a very real crack, a pain that had dried but was still there. She spoke softly, like a breath. Maybe that was why he understood me. Eli tilted her head slightly. Maybe it was because I could tell she was trying too hard. People who try to be strong are usually the ones who have endured too much. Clara chuckled, but the sound was choked. He spoke as if he could see right through me. Eli replied, his voice as deep as the earth. I didn't need to look. Her pain spoke for itself. The moment was so fleeting yet so deep that Clara felt every breath she took. She turned away, not wanting to let the tears show, but Eli saw. He moved closer, stopping right in front of her. He didn't touch her, but his eyes were as warm as a stove. Clara, don't lock yourself away anymore. If you want to be afraid, let me be afraid with you. If you want to be strong, let me stand by your side. You don't have to fight alone. Clara clutched the edge of her shirt. Tears fell without her having time to hide them. I don't know who I can trust anymore, Eli said in a voice as sure as an oath. Then start over, little by little. With me. The room suddenly became deathly silent, as if the whole house was holding its breath. Outside, the faint sound of insects could be heard. Inside, all that could be heard was the sound of her heart beating, not faster but heavier. Clara took a deep breath. Eli, I want to believe, but I'm still scared. He nodded. It's okay to be scared. I just need you to stop running. I have you. Abigail has you. Grady has you. We won't leave you alone. Clara said nothing more, but her hand on the table loosened, as if the fear had faded a little, not completely, but enough for her to breathe more deeply, as Clara stood up to return to her room. Eli said something that made her stop for a moment. Clara, he can come here, but if he touches this ranch door, he'll have to go through me first. Clara turned to look at him. Not a word, but in her eyes there was something very much like a flicker of faith. That night, as Clara held Jonas to sleep, she felt this clearly. Perhaps this was the first moment she felt she was no longer adrift in life. The sky over High Mesa the next day was unusually pale. Thick clouds hung low, almost touching the tops of the cottonwood trees at the edge of the ranch. The wind was humid, overcast but not cold enough to make one shiver. It was the kind of weather rarely seen in the west, when rain clouds rolled in without warning, light enough to change the color of the prairie. Clara stood on the porch, holding Jonas in her arms, looking up at the sky. In the distance, the thunder rolled slowly like a sigh from the earth and sky. Jonas rubbed his face against her neck. the small warmth making Clara feel a little calmer. But deep in her chest, the uneasiness still flowed like an underground stream that refused to recede. Abigail came out with the wool blanket. She and the baby were out too early. It was going to rain. Clara took the blanket and wrapped it around Jonas. I just wanted to get some air. I hadn't slept well last night. Abigail looked at her with understanding. She didn't have to pretend to be calm. I knew what Briggs had said last night had kept her up. Such things strike a woman's heart harder than one might think. Clara didn't deny it. I was still scared. When Briggs talked about that man, I felt like I was back in the old days. Abigail put her hand on her sister's shoulder, but unlike the other day, this time she was not alone. Clara smiled slightly. I was getting used to it. Hoofbeats sounded from the stables. Eli was checking every lock, every section of fence. His face focused as if missing even the smallest detail would allow danger into the ranch. He parked Apollo beside him, occasionally looking up at the porch where Clara stood. When their eyes met, Clara instinctively looked away, but her heart skipped a beat. The farm grew quieter as the first drops of rain began to fall. Not a heavy rain, just heavy drops that pattered on the tin roof and dusty ground. The wind carried the scent of wet earth, of soaked grass, the distinctive smell of rain on the open prairie. Grady emerged from the barn, his gray hair dripping wet. Rain was rare this time of year, but anyway, water for the vegetable beds was good. Eli looked around the farm, his eyes scanning every direction, every corner of his vision. Clara could see the alertness in his every movement, the way he listened for any strange sound. It made her feel both relieved and heavy. Abigail turned back into the house and motioned for Clara to follow. I'll roast some corn and make some ginger tea. It's a sad rainy day without a hot cup of tea. Clara nodded, handing Jonas back to her sister to hold, but as she entered the kitchen, she realized Eli was following her. He stood in the doorway, breathing evenly, but his eyes said otherwise. He asked in a slow, low voice, "Are you okay?" Clara forced a smile. I was still trying to be okay. Eli looked at her a long time, not in a scrutinizing way, more like he wanted to see how much the other person was struggling. He set his hat on the table, his jacket slipping off his shoulders as he sat down. Clara sat too, her hands clasped in her lap. The rain reminded me of Ohio. It was always cold there during the rainy season, but the rain here made me feel like I was breathing. Eli tilted her head. How did she see her homeland now? Clara mused. I don't know. There are places that used to be home, but once you leave, they can no longer be called home. Eli looked into the fire in the kitchen as if he were looking through it. I knew the feeling. Sometimes the place you were born in doesn't hold you back, but other places open up, even when you don't expect them. Clara chuckled. You're talking about High Mesa, Eli replied slowly. I was talking about a place where people could find themselves, not a place where people ran to when they were cornered. Clara bowed her head. I really came here because I had no other choice. No, Eli said firmly. She came here to find a new start. That wasn't like running away. Clara took a deep breath to control her rising emotions. If I were as strong as he said, I probably wouldn't be shaking like this. Eli slowly stood up. He walked over, stopping right next to her but not touching her. Being strong is not about not being afraid. Being strong is about being able to stand when you're very afraid. Clara felt her eyes burning. She looked away, not wanting anyone to see her tears. Eli continued, his voice as deep as the earth beneath his feet. Clara, you have overcome more than anyone I have ever met. Don't think fear makes you weak. It only shows you still know how to protect what is important. Clara replied softly. And the most important thing to me is Jonas. I know. Eli answered immediately, and that's why she wasn't alone. He needed to be safe, and so did she. Clara turned to look at him, out of duty or something else. It took Eli a few seconds to respond, but when he spoke, his voice was unwavering, because I wanted it that way. Not out of duty. The room was silent. Only the pattering of rain on the roof could be heard. Clara felt her heart rise and fall with her own breathing, not loudly, but pounding in the silence. Abigail came in from the kitchenette, holding a pot of tea. "Come to the table. The tea is hot." The air between Clara and Eli suddenly dissolved into a soft silence. He took a step back, making way for her, but his eyes still followed Clara's every step as if afraid she would slip in her own fear. That afternoon, tea was quiet amid the sound of rain. Jonas slept soundly in Abigail's lap. Grady sat cutting new leather straps. Eli occasionally glanced out the window, but Clara knew he was watching the house more than the outside. Clara took a sip of hot ginger tea, and for the first time in many nights, she felt a warmth spread deep into her heart, as if dispelling the chill of months of fear. As night fell, the rain lightened. Clara carried Jonas back to her room. When she closed the door, she saw Eli standing at the end of the hallway, the light of the oil lamp reflecting off his face. He spoke loud enough for only one person to hear. "Clara, you can sleep peacefully. I will guard the west gate tonight." Clara looked at him for a long time. He didn't need to do that. Eli replied in a voice that made her heart clench slightly. "I wanted to do that." Clara nodded slightly, then closed the door. As she leaned against the door, she felt a strange warmth in her chest. Not love yet, not yet spoken, but it was growing, and she knew that even if the past caught up with her, she no longer had to face it alone. The rain from the night before had continued into the early morning. As the sun rose from behind the mountains, High Mesa looked as if it had been washed clean by a thin layer of water. The grass on either side of the path held clear droplets, reflecting the sunlight in tiny slivers of gold. The air was cool, with a distinct earthy scent that made anyone who breathed deeply feel a little lighter. Clara woke early. Jonas slept soundly in his crib, his breath as light as the first puff of smoke of the morning. She stood by the window looking out at the misty prairie, speechless, feeling a rare peace after days of mental tension. But little Jonas stirred slightly, his little feet kicking lightly against the blanket. Clara bent down, pressed her hand to his chest, and whispered softly, "It's morning, my child. A new day, though I still feel my heart is troubled." She looked at him for a long time. Every time she looked, she knew she could not run away. Jonas needed her, and she, somehow, needed herself to be strong enough not to break. In the kitchen, the rhythmic sounds of Abigail making breakfast echoed through the house as Clara carried Jonas downstairs. The smell of toasted cornflakes filled the house as she walked down the stairs. Abigail turned and smiled warmly. She was down early. "Did she sleep well last night?" Clara put Jonas in the crib next to the table. "I slept. Not deeply, but I did." Abigail understood. "It only takes a few days." "Clara, the heart will get used to safety and sleep will come easier." Clara nodded silently, then helped Abigail set the table. As they worked, they chatted about light things, the approaching harvest, the northern trail that needed clearing, the new hens that had just hatched. These everyday stories helped Clara forget, for a moment, the feeling that someone was lurking somewhere. When Eli entered the kitchen, he had just taken off his wide-brimmed hat, which still had a few drops of rain from the night before on it. He walked straight to Jonas and looked down at him. There was a softness in his eyes, though he said nothing. Clara stood by the table, watching the scene, and, for the first time, she did not try to look away. Eli looked up and met her eyes. She had gotten up early. Clara answered softly. "I didn't want to disturb everyone with Jonas's crying. He was a little startled these days." Eli stepped closer. Children were perceptive. Perhaps he sensed her tension. Clara paused. "So, what should I do?" Eli spoke slowly, as if thinking from deep within her chest. She had to let herself breathe first. Jonas would be okay when she was okay. Clara heard that sentence as if she heard something very real, but hard to touch. She turned around slightly and continued cleaning the table to hide her rising emotions. While the family was having breakfast, Grady came in, his face not as pleasant as usual. He put a muddy handkerchief on the table and spoke in a low voice. "Eli, I found hoof prints on the bank of the stream. The wet ground made the prints very clear." Clara stopped. Her ears were ringing. Eli stood up immediately. "Not Apollo's. No," Grady said. "Not the ranch horses either. Sharper hooves, the kind worn by people who travel a lot." Abigail looked at Clara worriedly. "Are you okay?" Clara tried to keep her breathing steady. "I don't know." Eli put his hands on the edge of the table, as if to steady his sharp thoughts. "Grady and I will go check right away. Don't let anyone near the ranch," Clara blurted out before thinking, what if it was him? Eli looked straight at her, his eyes unwavering. "He wouldn't cross that bank. I guarantee it." The words rang out like an oath. But then, Clara noticed Eli walking faster than usual. His shoulders tensed as if he were about to enter a real battle. As they left the house, the sound of horse hooves grew louder, then fainter. The house was silent, as if holding its own breath. Abigail put her hand on Clara's back. "You don't have to stand like that. Sit down." Clara listened but could not sit. She stood, looking out the door, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. What if something had happened to him? Abigail touched her finger lightly. "Eli knows how to protect himself better than anyone I've ever seen. Trust me, he'll come back." But Clara wasn't so gullible. She'd lost too much since leaving Ohio to simply believe that everything would be okay. An hour later, the clouds had parted. But in Clara's heart, the sky was as heavy as before the storm. Jonas slept peacefully in his crib, his tiny hands clasped together, as if grasping for the warmth of the world. Clara sat down next to her child, quietly placing her hand on his chest. She tried to be strong, but she also knew she was slowly developing feelings for someone she didn't dare to think about. She had never said this out loud, not even to herself. But since Eli said those words last night, the long-suppressed emotions in her heart seemed to awaken. Not a heavy love, not a rash passion. It's a gentle warmth, like the sun touching the ground after the rain. But she didn't allow herself to dream more than that. Could someone like Eli open his heart to a woman who was haunted by past wounds like a shadow, lost in thought? Clara did not notice the sound of hooves approaching, slowly but surely. When the door opened and the wind blew in, she jumped to her feet. Eli entered, his jacket covered in mud, the smell of dirt and spring water lingering. Grady followed, his expression tense but not exactly fearful. Abigail ran forward. Any traces Eli nodded. Yes, but he left the stream before dawn. He seemed to be observing, not daring to enter. Clara felt her legs weaken, which meant he was really close. Eli looked at her for a long time. The moment was so long that Clara felt her heart stop beating. He spoke in a low, steady voice. "Yes, but he won't get any further. Not while I'm standing here." Clara looked at him, without blinking, without running. And for the first time, instead of being afraid, she found herself wanting to believe. Believe in that promise. Believe in the man before me. Believe in the warmth that has been kindled in my heart since the first days I set foot in High Mesa. The afternoon passed with a pale gray sky, no longer raining, but not quite sunny either. The atmosphere in the ranch seemed to be held in a state of limbo, not quite peaceful, but not quite unsettling. After returning from checking the creek, Eli and Grady continued to check the fences, checking every lock and every latch. Clara watched them from afar through the window, her heart suddenly heavy, knowing she was the reason the ranch had suddenly become a place to be on guard. Still, she couldn't take her eyes off Eli's figure. He moved vigorously, but in his footsteps, Clara saw something deeper, as if the man was carrying his own memories to fight off whatever was approaching. As the afternoon wore on, the kitchen lights came back on. Abigail was preparing a stew, the smell of spices filling the room with warmth. Clara sat chopping vegetables, but her hands were shaking so much she had to stop several times. Jonas fell asleep on Abigail's shoulder, his breathing soft as a feather. Abigail glanced quickly at Clara, then spoke softly. "You shouldn't blame yourself. None of us thought you were the cause of the trouble. What happened was out of your control." Clara bowed her head and took a deep breath. "I was just afraid that something would happen to everyone because of me." Abigail put the knife down on the table and stepped closer, her voice low, not as soft as usual. "Clara, I'm not telling you this to ease your worries, but to make you understand the truth. At this ranch, we all choose to stand together. We don't protect you out of pity. We do it because you deserve it." Clara wanted to reply, but her throat was too tight. She could only nod slightly. Dinner began as the afternoon wind picked up a bit. Grady told a few stories to break the awkward atmosphere, and Abigail laughed, the way she always did when she wanted someone to let go of their fears. Eli sat still, ate little, and occasionally glanced out the window. No one said anything, but Clara knew he hadn't relaxed at all since discovering the hoof prints that morning. When Jonas began to stir with sleep, Clara got up and carried him upstairs. She put Jonas in the crib and rocked him for a long time until he fell into a deep sleep. Then Clara stood before the window, bathed in the shimmering night light. The high Mesa night sky was different from any other place she had ever lived. It was deeper, quieter, with the feeling that all secrets were magnified in the darkness. And, in that vast silence, Clara gradually realized the things she had been trying to avoid. She had begun to care for Eli more than she wanted to admit. Care in a nameless way, with the feeling of uncertainty every time he left, with the relief when he heard his footsteps returning. But Clara wouldn't allow herself to feel more than that. The past had taught her that expectation was the shortest path to hurt. There was a very light knock, not the knock of someone in a hurry, but the knock of someone not wanting to scare her. Clara turned. Eli stood outside the door, his dark coat covered in dust. The kerosene lamp at the end of the hall cast a long shadow on the wooden floor. He spoke loudly. I think she was still awake. Clara went out and closed the door so Jonas wouldn't wake up. He wasn't asleep yet. Eli shook his head. "I'll be on the porch tonight. But before I go down, I need to ask you something." Clara nodded slowly, a little nervously. "Go ahead." Eli leaned lightly against the wooden railing beside the door, her arms crossed over her chest. What had Jonas Reed done to make her run away with the baby? Clara stood still. Her insides almost froze. It was the question she had never wanted to hear. The question held a wound deep within her that she had kept hidden for months. "I don't know where to start. Just start where you can breathe first." Clara closed her eyes and took a deep breath, but the memories were like ashes blown by the wind, clouding her mind. Jonas Reed is not Jonas's father. Clara's voice cracked slightly, but clearly. Eli stood still as if petrified, his eyes sharp but devoid of judgment. Clara continued, each word seeming to be drawn from the depths. He was a man who felt he had the right to control other people's lives. I had worked as a maid for his family. When the war ended, I had no work, so I tried to keep that job so I could have money to take care of my mother. He loved giving orders, loved making me afraid, and one day he crossed lines that I had no way to stop. Eli clenched his jaw. What had he done? Clara trembled slightly. I couldn't say anything. All I knew was Jonas wasn't his son, but he wanted me to stay so he could decide my fate. Whether I had a son or not, he wanted me. Eli closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. There was no longer anger in his eyes, but also such pain that Clara had to look away. "I understand," he said softly. She didn't need to go into details. No one should have to endure such things. Clara took a shaky breath. "I didn't run because I was afraid of him. I ran because I didn't want my child to grow up in that man's shadow." Eli took a step closer, slowly, so as not to startle her. She did the best thing a mother could do. Clara hugged her arms to her chest as if clutching her heart. But I didn't know if I would have the strength to continue if he found us. Eli looked deep into her eyes. His voice was deep as earth, but warm as fire. Clara, she had survived the worst. What was left, she would not face alone. Clara's lips trembled. I tried to keep my distance. But, Eli, I was afraid that if I believed in you, one day, you would leave. Eli took another half-step forward, his eyes never leaving her. I'm not a man who easily abandons someone, especially someone who is trying to live each day. The words were soft, but like thunder. Clara felt like crying, but she forced herself to hold them back. Eli continued, his voice so low that even his small voice carried clearly. If you allow me, I won't let you and Jonas face anything alone again. Clara shook her head slightly. I don't know what I have that would make you do that. Eli smiled a small smile, a smile that was reserved for no one but her. She didn't need anything. All I could see was one thing. She was the strongest woman I had ever met. In that moment, Clara's eyes were wet, not from pain, but because for the first time, someone looked at her and saw strength instead of pain. She whispered, Eli, thank you. He nodded. When you're ready to tell me more, I'll be here. Tonight. Sleep. I'll watch the door. Clara stepped back into the room, letting the hallway light fall on the man's face outside once more. Before closing the door, she looked at Eli for a long time. In a daze, she knew. Her heart had chosen to believe. The next morning, High Mesa was clear of rain and dew. The sky was so clear it stretched endlessly blue, the air carrying the gentle heat of early morning. But instead of calm, the ranch felt as thin as a rope tied to a door in a high wind. Clara woke up with a heavier heart than usual. Eli's words from last night echoed in her head for a long time. She didn't dare think too much, didn't dare touch the soft part of her heart. But when she looked over at the crib and saw Jonas sleeping peacefully with his hands raised unconsciously, she knew she had gone too far to go back to the old days of fear. She carried Jonas downstairs. The smell of baking cornflakes wafted through the air. Abigail was wearing an apron, stirring the pan and humming an old song. When Clara entered, Abigail looked up and smiled warmly. Had she gotten any sleep? Not much, but I feel a little lighter. Abigail looked into her eyes for a moment and nodded as if she understood something unspoken. I guessed someone had been standing guard on the porch all night. Clara bent down to Jonas's crib mattress to hide her embarrassment. He just wanted to make sure no one came near the ranch. Abigail let out a small laugh. Clara, there are things I can see at a glance. Eli doesn't just protect the ranch. He protects you. Clara bit her lip. I wasn't sure I could believe it. Some things are up to you to believe or not. But I have eyes. Abigail set down the pan. Eli looked at her in the way men reserve for those they respect. Clara wanted to reply, but the words caught in her throat. She knew Abigail was right, but admitting it was harder than facing what she had been running from. The front door opened. Grady came in, hat low, dust on his shoulders. I'd just met Briggs. He said someone had seen a horse across the fields to the north last night. Couldn't make out the face, but the timing, too good. Clara froze for a few seconds. Jonas stirred slightly in the crib as if sensing the change in the atmosphere. Abigail put her hand on Clara's shoulder and squeezed. It didn't mean it was him. There were plenty of people roaming freely in the West, but Clara could no longer keep her composure. She swallowed. Where was Eli at the stables? Going for another round, Grady said, then looked at Clara. She didn't need to worry. He still had some distance. But that distance to Clara was like a thin line. Clara picked up Jonas and walked out onto the porch. The bright light made her eyes narrow. In the stables, Eli was retying Apollo's bridle, his face a stone in the morning light. When he heard Clara's footsteps, he stopped and turned. Clara approached, unable to hide her trembling. I heard someone was passing through the northern fields last night. Eli nodded slowly. Yes, Briggs was investigating further, but nothing was certain. But he still wanted to go. Eli didn't beat around the bush. I had to know exactly who it was. I wouldn't let him get any further. Clara squeezed Jonas in her arms, as if wanting his voice to steady her. What if it really was him? Eli stepped closer. They were only inches apart. His face was calm, but behind that calm was a storm waiting to be named. I will handle it, not you. Clara looked at him deeply. I don't want you to be in danger because of me. Eli answered without hesitation. I don't consider it dangerous. Clara, there are things that men have to do. This is what I need to do. Clara felt her eyes burn. Jonas was fast asleep, his head on her shoulder, his soft breathing comforting. I didn't want anyone else dragged into my affairs. Eli took a step forward, his voice low, deep, as firm as a rock in the ground. She wasn't dragging me into anything. I was going in on my own, and I wasn't going back. At that moment, the morning light fell on the two of them, allowing Clara to see Eli's facial structure more clearly than before. The slight wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, a sign of experience. The broad forehead of someone who had shouldered more than he could bear, and the deep, silent eyes, not only looking at her but also seeing through the things she tried to hide. Clara took a deep breath, trying to regain the composure that was leaving her. Eli, last night I told you something I'd never dared to tell anyone. But there was something else. I was afraid that if you found out, it would change everything. Eli narrowed his eyes. She kept talking. Clara trembled slightly. I was afraid if I put my trust in him, I would lose him like I had lost everyone else I had. Eli stood very close. He spoke in a voice that was not loud, but had a weight that made Clara almost forget to breathe. I'm not a shadow of your past. I am the person standing before you now, and I will still be standing here if you let me. Clara closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, she saw in Eli's eyes more than just a promise, but a choice he had made himself. Eli slowly placed his hands on the railing of the stable, not touching Clara, but his presence was like an invisible embrace around both mother and daughter. Clara, no one can live in fear forever. I know, because I used to, but she had run long enough. It was time for her to stop, with us. Clara heard the wind blowing gently through the roof, the horse snorting in the stable, Jonas's steady breathing. All these sounds combined gave her a strange feeling, a kind of courage she thought she had lost long ago. She said very softly, If you don't leave, I won't run any more. Eli looked at her, standing still as if he wanted to freeze that moment in himself. I'm staying, no matter what. And just then, from the distant path came the strange sound of horse hooves. The rhythm was not like that of an ordinary passerby. It was deliberate, even strong, and unhurried. Eli turned his head immediately. Someone was coming. Clara hugged Jonas tighter, her heart clenched as if someone were squeezing it. Was it him? Eli put his hand on the gun at his side. I'll know in a few minutes. The wind changed direction. The sky grew dark, though the sun was still shining. Something was coming. No more hiding, no more avoiding, and Clara understood. This was the first moment where her past truly met her future. The distant hooves of horses stretched like a thread through the tense air of High Mesa. Clara stood still, holding Jonas close to her chest. She could barely feel her legs, but she stood tall, as if fear no longer had the power to knock her down. The wind blew through the eaves, rustling against the wooden walls like an unnamed warning. Eli stood in front of her, not saying another word. He raised his hand slightly, signaling her to come in, but Clara did not move. She spoke very softly. I want to see clearly. I don't want to hide behind anyone anymore. Eli looked at her for a few seconds. There was surprise and respect in his eyes. He nodded slowly, but though she stood still, she was not alone. Clara didn't reply, but her chest tightened with the feeling. It wasn't exactly protective, but like two souls finding a foothold they thought they'd lost. From a distance, the silhouette of a rider became clearer, not the gait of a drunkard, nor the familiar figure of a herdsman from the area, a dark cloak, sitting upright on horseback, very familiar to Clara's fear. Eli put his hand on his gun, not taking his eyes off the approaching person. "Clara, go inside." But Clara shook her head. "I wanted to be sure." The rider stopped at the ranch gate, looking around like a stranger on unfamiliar territory. He did not dismount. He only lifted his helmet, revealing his face. Clara held her breath, but she did not recognize him. "He is not Jonas Reed." Her whole body relaxed with relief, but instead another worry rose up. Eli took a step forward, putting himself between Clara and the stranger. Who was he looking for? Eli's voice was low, not loud, but enough for the other person to understand that he was not someone to be trifled with. The stranger smiled, but not in a challenging way. "I was looking for Eli Maddox. I heard he lived around High Mesa. I had a question." Clara glanced at Eli. His expression didn't change. He just shrugged, as if the thought of someone looking for him didn't bother him. "I'm Eli Maddox. What do you want?" The stranger looked around, then dismounted, leaving a clear mud trail in his wake. He put his hands on the saddle, as if trying to buy time before speaking. "My name is Russell Quinn. I worked with Sheriff Briggs for many years. I came to tell you, last night, along the border, someone saw signs of illegal camping. The embers of a fire were fresh, and there were large boot prints and a slight limp." Eli stood up straighter. "Jonas Reed." Russell nodded slowly. "Most likely." Clara held Jonas so tightly that she didn't realize her hands were cold. He was so close. Russell glanced at Clara and then turned back to Eli. "I'll coordinate with Briggs, but I came first to warn you. That guy is very persistent. He could be in the area for days." Eli clenched his jaw. "I understood." Russell looked at Clara again. "You are Clara Hollis." "Right." Clara instinctively backed away, but Eli leaned over, partially covering her. "How did he know her name?" Russell let out a heavy breath. "Briggs said you needed protection, and the other person has likely been tracking you for months. I just want you to know we won't let it happen again." Clara nodded slightly. "Thank you, but I just want everyone on the ranch to be safe." Russell looked at Eli, then back at Clara. So the best thing she could do was to trust this man. Clara bowed her head and said nothing more. Russell mounted his horse, tightened the reins, and turned to leave. The sound of hooves faded away, leaving a silence so heavy that you could hear the wind blowing through the grass. Only when Russell's figure disappeared behind the hill did Eli turn back to look at Clara. Was she okay? Clara held Jonas close, but this time her trembling was less than usual. "I'm fine. It's just, he was really close." Eli didn't say he knew. He just stepped closer, standing right in front of her. The wind blew his hair back from his forehead, revealing deep, silent eyes that seemed to hold all her pain. He spoke softly. "Clara, you don't need to worry about everything alone anymore." Clara bent down to Jonas. "I don't know how much more my heart can take." Eli lifted her chin with a touch so light it was barely there. She could take more than she thought. I saw that better than anyone. Clara closed her eyes, her eyelashes trembling as if she were about to cry. If Jonas Reed really came here, what would happen? Eli replied slowly as the promise hit the ground. Then he would have to face me before touching her. Clara opened her eyes and looked straight at him. Why would he do so much for me? Eli's voice softened to the point that it made Clara want to cry. Because I don't want to see someone as strong as her tremble again. Clara, you deserve so much more peace. There was no immediate response, just wind and breathing, and the silence left Clara unsure whether to stand still or step back. But Eli didn't ask. He just stood there, like a solid wall she could lean against at any moment. Abigail called from the door, "Why don't you come in? The wind is going to be strong." Clara started slightly and turned around. I went in immediately. Eli kept looking at her. Clara, don't keep your fear inside. If you feel anything, tell me. Clara held his gaze for a few beats. Her voice was shaky but clear. There was something I wanted to say, but I wasn't sure I was ready. Eli nodded slightly, not pushing. When you're ready, I'll be here. Clara hugged Jonas and walked into the house. But as soon as she turned around, she felt something she had never felt before in her entire life. Someone was behind her, not letting her fall, not letting her be afraid alone, and that made her legs feel light as if she had just let go of a fear that had haunted her all her life. Clara didn't turn around, but Eli continued to watch, his eyes filled with more than just protection, but something deeper, growing with each passing day, even though he hadn't said it out loud. Late afternoon fell over High Mesa, a deep red streak across the horizon, like the embers of a long, restrained day. The wind picked up, pushing patches of grass askew as if signaling a restless night. Clara stood by her window, Jonas in his crib, sound asleep and safe, but the child's peace could not mask the uneasiness rising inside her. From the yard below, Eli shouted at Apollo to back off, the sound of his hooves hitting the dry ground loud and clear. Clara couldn't see, but she knew his face held an unspoken tension. When Russell left this morning, something had changed in Eli's eyes. Not anger, not fear, but the determination of a man preparing to face something he already knew, but still had to get up and go. Clara held Jonas, pressed her face into his soft hair, and took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was no longer the woman who ran away. But as the sky darkened, as the shadows stretched across the prairie, she could not help but feel as if Jonas Reed's shadow was drawing closer by the minute. The kerosene lamp on the porch was lit. The light cast a long yellow streak on the ground, creating a shadow of Eli standing alone looking towards the path. Clara heard her footsteps as she walked out, but Eli kept his eyes on her, not turning around. He asked first, his voice low as if leaning against the wind. She couldn't sleep. Clara moved closer. No, I have a feeling that tonight everything will change. Eli turned, his gaze so deep that Clara felt herself fall into a strange silence. Yes, something was going to happen, but no matter what, I wasn't leaving this place. Clara hugged Jonas, as if leaning on the child's peaceful breathing. He didn't need to be exposed to all this danger. Eli looked at her, his eyes hard but warm enough to soothe Clara's trembling heart. I don't stand alone because of responsibility. I stand here for you and the boy. Clara trembled slightly, but did not retreat. Eli, you have no idea how scared I was. I used to think that if I didn't run, I would be suffocated by the past. But now, standing here, I found that I was no longer afraid in the same way. I was afraid of losing things that I had yet to name. Eli stepped closer, leaving only a few inches between them. Clara, you don't need to name it right now. We just need a reason to stop. I have one. And I think you have one too. Clara looked down at Jonas. I do. He was the first reason, but there was one more thing. Eli waited, not pushing. Clara looked up, her eyes glistening in the lamplight. He was all that remained. The wind blew through the eaves as if to carry the words away, but Eli heard them clearly. For a moment, his face softened. He didn't smile broadly, just a softness at the corners of his eyes and a deeper breath than usual. Clara continued, her voice low but firm. I was afraid I would lose him if things went badly, afraid that if he came here and hurt anyone on the ranch, I would be the one to hurt someone else. Eli placed a hand on the railing near her. If you want to protect us, do what a strong mother would do. Stay calm, keep Jonas close, and don't let fear make you tremble alone. Clara was silent. I am trying. But Eli, are you scared? Eli looked out at the black field before him. Yes, any man who says he isn't afraid is lying, but I've experienced losing someone I love. I don't want to watch it happen again. Afraid or not, I'll still be standing here." Clara wanted to put her hand on him, but she didn't dare. She just said softly, "If I said, 'I believe you,' really, would you believe me?" Eli turned back to look straight at her. "I believe." A silence as soft as a bird's wing passed, and then, from afar, a sound came, very faint, but enough for Eli to hear before anyone else. The sound of rocks being moved, the slow, heavy beat of hooves as if someone was trying not to make a sound. Eli immediately tightened his grip on his gun. "Clara, get inside. Take Jonas to the kitchen. Lock the door. Don't come out until I call you." Clara felt a chill in her chest. "Eli, he's here." Eli didn't answer right away, but his eyes sharpened like a fire-stained knife. "I need you to trust me now." Clara nodded vigorously. "I believe." She turned, grabbed Jonas, and ran inside, her heart pounding so hard she had to force herself to keep her breathing steady so he wouldn't be scared. The kitchen door was locked. Abigail squeezed Clara's hand. Grady had the old pistol on the table. No one spoke aloud, but each look conveyed the knowledge that the moment had come. Outside on the porch, the sound of footsteps became clearer. The wood creaked slightly as someone touched the porch post. Then a man's voice spoke, a drawl, as if he had been standing in the shadows for months, waiting for this moment. Clara, she had hidden long enough. Eli stood in the middle of the porch, his shadow blocking the door behind him. He didn't move, not an inch. His voice was colder than any other night before. It wasn't him she needed to see. Clara's breath caught behind the kitchen door. Jonas stirred slightly, and she held him close. The other man laughed, his voice hoarse and mocking. "So you're standing in her way." "Maddox," Eli replied, each word heavy as thunder. "I stood for my family inside the kitchen." Clara's heart skipped a beat. He used the word family. It's not a slip of the tongue. It's not about speaking for someone else. It's about choosing. Clara put Jonas down in the crib, her hands shaking, but her eyes suddenly different. In that moment, she realized something she had never realized in her entire life. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of herself anymore, and when she put her hand on the doorknob, Abigail stopped her, but Clara only whispered, "I won't run again. Not today. Not ever again." Clara and Eli's story reminds us that life, no matter how stormy, always has a place of peace for those who have the courage to continue. No one is truly strong when they stand alone, and sometimes healing comes not from flowery words, but from the quiet presence of someone who knows how to listen, who knows how to stand by us in our weakest moments. In our old age, we look back and understand that the most precious thing is not the peaceful years, but the people who held our hands through those troubled years. This story invites each of us to remember who was the Eli in our lives, and also to ask ourselves, can we become a source of warmth for someone who needs a support? Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. If this story touches your memory or heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so Frontier Hearts can have more opportunities to bring you deeper healing journeys.